It's Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. in Switzerland, and it's Space Café WebTalk time. Our Space Café WebTalk, 33 minutes with Doug Loverro, will begin soon. And a very happy New Year to all of you, of course. Thanks for joining us for our talk today about rethinking the inevitable, why we need to stop hoping and prepare for space warfare. As always, we appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback. And if you hear me stucking on inevitable on this word, it's obviously my own mantra not to go with it. So it sounds funny, I know, but you know what I mean. However, I'm Thorsten Grüning, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcasts. Our latest edition is 18, was released just before Christmas on all the major platforms. We also keep our fan shop open for you, where you can support us actively and become a Space Watcher. Edition 1 has cool mugs, masks, awesome t-shirts, and brand new reflecting backpacks and jackets and more cool items for you, your friends, and the ones you love. Your support is needed to keep our work alive for you. If you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the events section and on YouTube. We host our Space Café web talks live on a weekly basis. This is already the 39th edition today, and so I hope you mark Tuesdays in your calendars. But I can tell you later on you will hear a few of our activities that we are planning for you this year, so stay tuned. I feel very privileged today to kick off this year's Space Cafés with one of the, for me at least, most inspiring space thinkers in my show. Someone I respect for his work and his direct conversation in our sector. And with that, a warm welcome, Doug Loverro, in our Space Café today.
Thank you, Thorsten. Great to be here.
Thanks for having you. So, a little bit about you. Doug is a highly regarded national space thinker and leader who provides strategic advice and guidance to multiple elements of the national security and civil space sectors. He most recently served as the Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations for NASA and previously as the Deputy Assistant for the Secretary of Defense for Space Policy in the Pentagon. He was a prime mover in this stand-up for the U.S. Space Force, and Doug holds a Master of Science in Physics from the University of New Mexico, a Master of Political Science from Auburn University, and an MBA from the University of West Florida. He is a recipient of multiple prestigious awards, including the Secretary of Defense Medal of Outstanding Public Service, the IAAA's Durant Lecturer for Public Service, the National Defense Industrial Association Bob Hope's Distinguished Citizen Award, and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Federation of Galaxy Explorers, amongst many other civilian and military honors. Once more, Doug, welcome to the show. And it's just a 33-minute show, so let's get into that immediately. So the topic of our talk and your opinion piece that we published on SpaceWatch.Global yesterday got us, how do you call it, some engagement with our audience. I would like to start with a short intro into the topic from you. So why are you coming to this conclusion, the statement that the preparation of space warfare is inevitable?
Sure, thank you, Thorsten, and welcome to everybody who tuned in to the channel today. So this, as you said, I have arrived at this conclusion that that space warfare, and that's a loaded term, and we'll unpack it in a little while. But attacks in space and attacks against space systems, in my opinion, are inevitable, and I've come to that conclusion for several reasons. Number one, they're already going on. They're already happening in space. They've been happening for years, many years, both in a test mode, and I review some of the history of anti-satellite work in the paper that I wrote. But even more specifically, in just about every war that the U.S. has fought in the last 20 or 30 years, some aspect of space warfare has occurred. Now, most of the time, it's electronic warfare. Most of the time, it's electronic warfare from the ground. But we have seen folks obviously test and demonstrate other aspects of that. And as I thought about this question a lot, especially when I was part of the DoD, part of the space policy leadership within the Department of Defense, and working with our allies, I came to the conclusion, and I talk about this in the opening paragraphs of the paper. If a nation is being attacked by somebody else's weapons, which are being guided to their target by space systems, by every law of armed conflict that we know, that space system becomes a legitimate target. And it is, in fact, and I made this point both in the paper and when I spoke to the UN about this several years ago, it is really the sovereign duty of that nation to go ahead and interrupt that kill chain to protect their citizens, their troops, their economic capability. It is their duty to do so. And so to tell somebody that for the sake of some ethereal notion that space should be special, that we should not defend our citizens from attacks that are led through or enabled by space, makes little sense. What does make sense is to talk about how will those operations be conducted? But to go ahead and suggest that that you can't defend yourself because of the placement of the object in space really has no basis in either customary international law or our experience.
So the international community tries to keep alive, and you talk about the failure of PAROS, of PPWT, but it seems that measuring success is a challenge here. What recommendation do you offer to approach these efforts differently?
Yeah, I think, and this is the reason why I wrote the piece. I think we need to change the conversation to approach it differently. I will tell you, the first time I actually started talking about this in any detail was after I had left, talking about it in detail within the open press, was after I left the DoD and I attended the 50th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty in 2017 in Geneva. And we were, 50 of us around the table talking about the success of the 1967 treaty, and in a maudlin way talking about the fact that we have been trying to pass PAROS since the 80s and haven't made no progress. And when it came my time to talk, I said, well, if the last 30 years we have not been able to go ahead and get agreement, even a little bit of agreement on the concept of PAROS, perhaps we should start to talk about something else, because it's probably pretty obvious that this is not going to be the basis or the foundation for us to go for our future. And so my belief was that we had convinced ourselves that because we were able to achieve agreement back in 1966, 1967 on the Outer Space Treaty, that we could go ahead and repeat that act with something as comprehensive as PAROS. And it was clear that something that comprehensive to me, it was clear to me, and I think it should have been clear to those folks who have been who have been working for over a generation. I mean, remember, 30 years means we've had a generation of diplomats who have been trying and failing to go ahead and make progress on PAROS. We should recognize that tact was not going to take us where we needed to be. By the way, I think there are many ways to attack this. I think the British proposal that is in front of the committee right now is a very good proposal to do just what I've suggested in many ways, which is to get opinions of where do we think we can make progress? What are the kinds of things we can make progress on? Because I believe that it's far more inspiring to make incremental progress and far more useful to make incremental progress than to try to take a big leap and to never make progress on it. I will share with you a child's book that I read way back when I was young, and that I used to keep on my shelf in the office. It was called The Big Jump, and it was about a king who challenged one of his young squires. Asked, "How do I get to be king?" And the king asked, "Well, you have to learn how to jump to the top of the castle." And the squire could not figure out how to jump to the top of the castle. And the king, at the end of the story, I hate to break the suspense for you, but the king at the end of the story says, "Well, you jump there one step at a time." And I believe that that's the same way that we should approach this kind of discussion, is one step at a time. We can go ahead and make progress on trying to make space safer, more peaceful, less hostile, knowing that we may not get to the top of the castle, but at least we'll have covered several steps.
Okay, get your point on that. So, I mean, in your text, you are focusing on ASAT or the anti-satellite developments, and all these development that goes in parallel. So, are saying small steps. That's I think a great idea, but all these developments for defending nation space or nations objects in space going on. So, I mean, just on the example of the ASAT and the current club of 4, as you mentioned that, aren't space objects also subject to other threats, such as cyber, on-orbit servicing, another word I like, proximity activities, and so on? Are those as dangerous as simple ASATs? I mean, there's no simple ASAT, but from the level of what they can, how dangerous they can be.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, you know, in the essay, I talk about just really some very few specific topics in there, mostly because of the limits of space and time. But I think this is a very wide-reaching discussion. And it doesn't just deal with arms control discussions, it deals with other civil space discussions as well. SSA sharing, rules of the road for proximity operations and on-orbit servicing, the elimination of debris-causing activities, not necessarily weapons, but debris-causing activities. How do we go ahead and reconcile the large mega constellations and the places they inhabit in space? How do we legislate who can appropriate a shell of space for 15,000 satellites? I think all of these things mixed together to create a set of rules that can again make space far more hospitable to peaceful action, and far less likely to lead to war. Recognizing we will never eliminate that capability, but we will go ahead and structure a rule set, just as we have in other sovereign areas like the sea, that will aid in the normal, peaceful economic activities that we would like, and diminish the likelihood that we will unintentionally escalate into war. And so I think proximity operations is a key question for that, and we should be setting up rules for what does proximity, what do we mean by proximity operations, and how do we conduct those? What's allowed, what's not allowed? I think all of those are good. The interesting thing is some of those discussions don't belong in a disarmament discussion. They belong in a COPUOS discussion, or they belong in other civil authority discussions. So my view is that this is a complement of activities that we as nation states need to undertake. I was specifically focused on the disarmament side in the essay, but there is a wide-ranging set of things that are each individual steps on the way to the top of that castle.
Absolutely. And in one of the comments I received from Teresa earlier today was that, and you mentioned it as well, we have to take this entire discussion, which is super complex in its own, out of these defense and military activities are per se, because we do have now space as an economic zone defined and established for us. So, but what does that mean? And also for what are the implications for business models, for insurance, for all of that? What comes down this line? But let's stay on our discussion. So, for me, putting all that together, I came up with this question: is arms control in space an illusion? I mean, anything that goes at a speed of whatever 27,000 kilometers per hour has such a huge kinetic energy that it is considered a weapon per se.
Right. So well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been arguments. My good friend Brian Whedon, I don't know if Brian is on today. He and I argue over whether or not any satellite can be considered a weapon because of the great speed, right? And Brian correctly says, look, it does take more than just a satellite to go ahead and do it. You need guidance systems, you need other things like that can specifically target other things. But in concept, anything in space can be a weapon, and I think that, of course, is the point. That's one of the reasons that the U.S. and other nations have used to not agree to these large, very aggressive arms control treaties, because it's too hard to distinguish what is a weapon and what is not a weapon. On the other hand, I don't think we should allow the notion that speed or the result of an impact should go ahead and deny us the capability to recognize that we really can restrain some activities. There's a lot in the history of arms control, and especially I'd like to point to the chemical weapons treaties. There's a lot of things about chemical weapons treaties that are not verifiable. We know that 100%. But that doesn't prevent us from trying to prevent them, from trying to outlaw them, and it doesn't prevent us from punishing nations that do use them. So it is, I'm not a Pollyanna, if that's probably an American expression, talking about a Disney movie, but that I'm not naive enough to believe that just because we come to an agreement, it will eliminate these threats. It won't. But it will at least convince most nations that there are other ways that they should think about this problem than the easiest way. And in fact, what we have seen in the 4 examples that I use in the paper in the Club of Nations, arguably the easiest way to go ahead and deal with this is a direct ascent kinetic energy weapon. But that's not that is far from the preferable way, either from the standpoint of that person being attacked or the attacker. And so if we agreed that that was a mechanism that is too harmful to the space environment, too dangerous for future economic activity, well, the nations will still go ahead and look for ways to eliminate the danger from space-enabled attack, but maybe they will invest in other mechanisms.
In preparation of our talk today, I had a chat with a number of people about the text we published yesterday, and in reference to you stating we hope for peace and prepare for war, to that our good friend, and with that greetings to Canada, our good friend Jessica West said, hope is clearly not enough. So we must equally prepare or work for peace. Why do we just hope for peace at the moment?
Mhm. Yeah, actually, I don't think I ever said that we should hope for peace and prepare for war. I did say we should prepare for war. And Jessica, by the way, great to hear from you. Always great to discuss things with you. But when I say prepare for war, it's not prepare militarily. It's prepare legally. It's to create the rule set that prepares us to go ahead and make sure that if war occurs in space, that it occurs on terms that we can all live with. And I think there's something else that's very important as well. One of the things that I worked on a lot when I was in the DoD, and that the DoD has adopted as part of its strategy, is to try to go ahead and create a much higher level of deterrence against space attack, and that is through the creation of what's called resilience, of making space systems harder to attack.
Mm-hmm.
That may seem a little bit of oxymoronic, to suggest that you can go ahead and make attacks less likely if you make something harder to attack. But in reality, what it does is it basically says if you have to raise the level of both investment and action that an adversary must take in order to go ahead and deny a capability, well, then he or she, the adversary, will probably begin to look for other venues and other mechanisms to achieve their goals. So in this regard, what I mean is if a satellite can be disabled by a very low power laser attack, for example, well, then that's something that's easily done and that nations will do. If, on the other hand, you harden a satellite against laser attack, so they would need a much larger facility, and their surety of a successful attack would be lower, they may find that investment is not even worthwhile, that instead they will look for other mechanisms, perhaps a cyber attack, that would go ahead and deny that capability. And that's not to say that a cyber attack is preferential to a laser attack, but the point is that you're trying to go ahead and convince all of us that attacks on space system aren't the preferred method of engaging in hostilities. And as the quote that I gave in the article from China, they correctly point out that right now, if you're fighting the United States, attacks in space are probably the most irresistible and tempting choice. And that's because space has not become as robust as other areas of warfare. And so our job is to make that more robust, more resilient, so that it's not an irresistible and tempting choice, and that people look elsewhere. Hopefully they look to diplomatic action rather than to war action.
I think that's what we all work for, and not just hope. And I'm happy that Jessica just texted that she is really enjoying our answers and the conversation. So thank you. That's obviously we do quite a job here. So next one. So another thought was, or another feedback I got was, how do you see the US and this US action being a driver towards an inevitable conflict in space?
That's a great question. Many people, obviously, when the discussions broke into the public about the Space Force, many people said that would go ahead and militarize space. I think I wrote a piece back then that said space has been militarized for the U.S. at least since the late 1950s. And in fact, if you look back at the original U.S. space policy written by President Eisenhower in 1958, it clearly delineates civil space and military space as two different things. The U.S. actions clearly have been vocal about how we view the need to protect and secure our space capabilities. There's no question about that. I don't know that I agree with all words that have been said by all space leaders within the U.S., but I think the notion is that we understand that we are reliant on space, and we understand that that reliance creates an attractive target for adversaries, and that we will be forced to defend those. And we also understand that other adversaries, other nations, I shouldn't call them adversaries because the hope is that they won't be adversaries, but other nations are also integrating space into their militaries. And if a U.S. Interest came under attack from a space-enabled system, the U.S. would have to view that as a legitimate target as well. So I think that the creation of the Space Force and the things that the U.S. is doing is a practical realization of the state of affairs. Again, one of the things that I'm arguing for, that even as you have that realization, you really need to go ahead and work the other side as well, which is to figure out how we reduce the level of damage from any attacks in space. Quite frankly, my belief was that this would be a natural tendency for a Space Force to try to work this. One of the things that is not necessarily seen on the international stage is one of the biggest reasons that the U.S. has not been able to advocate for the kinds of restraints that we should have is because there hasn't been any agreement in the U.S. about what those should be. And that lack of agreement is because we don't have good doctrine about how space figures in military combat. And so my belief was that creating a Space Force would help create the doctrine that would then allow us to promote, that the U.S. could become a leader in promoting the kinds of things in space that we would like to avoid.
Heavy words. And will the inauguration of the upcoming Biden administration change your views on that, or are these views agnostic to any of the administrations you have?
Somewhat agnostic, but clearly the Biden administration is more interested in international arms control than the Trump administration. So I think this is a very good time for us to go ahead and be entering into this discussion. I think that that if we can come up with practical limits on space warfare, if we can come up with agreements that don't try to go ahead and say that we will never allow any kind of space attacks to occur, but if we try to go ahead and identify those things we find most dangerous, I believe that you'll find an active partner in the Biden administration.
That's great. That will be great. I mean, just to spoil you and our audience, on the 26th of January, I will have the chance to welcome Peter Martinez from the Secure World Foundation in my Space Cafés, and I hope that he will talk about their recommendations as they worked on for the Biden administration in more detail. I mean, we published this excerpt or this abstract of this document, but it's great to have a conversation about it. Another question, with the doctrine, with the strategic approach you laid out, how do your alliance partners perceive your views? Are they in agreement or aligned? I mean, sure. I can say that from the German side or from the NATO side. So, hey, how would Germany see that? But I don't want to raise this question because that is a completely different discussion I've seen.
Well, number one, I don't pretend to speak for our allies, so I don't want to go ahead and articulate what their views may or may not be. I can tell you some of the conversations that I've had. Number one, back in the winter of 2000, and I think it was 18, NATO invited me over again after I had become a private citizen. NATO invited me over to talk about whether or not NATO needed a space policy, and I spoke to the ministerial committee on the need for a space policy for NATO. And I don't want to pretend that my talk was the deciding factor, but soon thereafter, NATO decided that it needed a space policy, and it has created a space policy of its own. I've spoken to many allies. In fact, we had a international discussion under the context of what we called the Combined Space Operations Initiative, the CSPO initiative. And so we were able to talk with a lot of our allies in that. And some allies were certainly more along the lines of, well, we should try to keep space peaceful rather than try to go ahead and prepare for war. And I articulated to them many of the same thoughts that we've spoken about here today in more detail about how would they view things that attacked their citizens from space, and wouldn't that cause them to rethink their opposition to some sort of space control activities, and many of those allies admitted that it would cause them to rethink it. And I think this is one of the interesting concepts here, is that, you know, as we think about this, if we have this hard dividing line between either peaceful or not peaceful, then we really have no way to measure the harm from certain activities, and we in fact have no way to go ahead and tweeze apart those things that are acceptable to some nations and unacceptable to other nations. When you have this discussion in detail, most nations agree, sure, jamming is an absolutely acceptable form of space attack. So right away, we know that folks agree to that. Well, is that jamming allowed to be done from a space-based asset? Well, sure, we would be okay with the jamming being done by a space-based asset. What difference does it make? So you have to have this discussion and find out where each nation's line is, that they say, okay, that's a line I would not cross. But when you simply try to demark it as either yes or no, then it becomes an impossible discussion.
Absolutely. And I hope that our audience got some food for thoughts around the topic, and because there are other forums, as we know, that are talking in much more detail about it, and just pointing out to the PSSI and their conferences where we also had the chance to meet, and other places. We just try to foster this dialogue on these kind of topics. So one final question from me, and we have a number of questions from the audience which we will not have a chance to answer today, but I will send them over to you, and with a wish to maybe answer them, that we can send out the answers in the recap then by end of this week. So would you share your own thoughts about human activities, our human activities in space in general in the future? How can you envision that?
Sure. Well, you know, I am obviously a space dreamer. I've been that way ever since I grew up during the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo era. I have been absolutely 100% thrilled to see the increase in activities in space, both on the human exploration side, the economic development side, the number of nations who get to partake in space these days. I think it's a marvelous thing. Now, I'm not the kind of a dreamer that thinks that we're going to have a colony on Mars in the next 50 years. I think unfortunately, my science degrees hold me back from being that ambitious. But I absolutely believe that there are valuable things that we can get from the use of space to exploit for the betterment of humankind. And again, my purpose here is to try to go ahead and make sure that we can retain that value in the future by not spoiling the environment, by making sure that we have rules that protect nations as they go ahead and explore the universe, to make sure that we have rules that don't lead to unintended consequences about how we utilize space. Some of those, again, are not disarmament talks; they're civil space discussion talks. But I think it's marvelous to see the numbers of nations who are launching states increasing, the number of nations who are owning space assets increasing, the number of nations who are joining into exploration efforts, scientific efforts. The Japanese, of course, just brought back a sample from an asteroid. What a fantastic accomplishment! All right. I mean, I think these things are really important for humankind, and not to mention the support to our studies of climate change. And so I'm very positive and upbeat on the future of space exploration, economic development, and other kinds of utilization of space, which is why I believe it's important that we go ahead and treat space just like any other economic area and international area, with a set of rules that helps us assure that it will be there for the long term.
Thank you very much. I don't want to add any comment on that because I like these your final words on that. I'm afraid, as we are sticking to our 33 minutes, I'm afraid we have to come to an end. And I know we are now on the 16 or 10:36 so there's a grace period even for us. Even I would like to enjoy our conversation, and I'm quite sure we will do in the future. So, but be sure that we will follow up on these topics you raised in future Space Café web talks and in our magazine, of course. So, and now for the next events, and we are starting back into a full January, and I'm just pointing out now to the next 4 events. So next week I will talk with Mahmoud Abu Wazel from the Hague Institute of Global Justice on their new space initiatives. And I can tell you that's a must-listen event because there are some ideas floating around that are absolutely important and going in line with what we just talked about. A day later, we will kick off our Space Café Australia, hosted by Melanie Jane Ward, with Jackie Carpenter from the One Giant Leap Australia as her guest. Why are we doing Australia? Because, hey, Australia is cool and has something to offer, and we want to place the space cafes around the world. And we have a number of talks with people with Ian in Brazil, in the UAE, in Italy, in Russia, to have these platforms established to inform, to educate, yes, also to entertain the audience, but to come together at one place. And also next week, I want to point out that on 12th and 13th January will be also the European Space Conference. So I would say the absolute high-level conference that we have in Europe in Brussels. It will happening, or again, mainly online for those are interested and of course registered, because it comes at a price. And one day later, on the 14th, we will have our second edition of the Space Café Black Ops by Ralph Thiele about quantum technologies and their military and defense application. And that's something we didn't allude to today, something around the corner, including AI and quantum and so on, which I wouldn't, in my naive view, we can't control, but that's another level, I think. So, and then on 19th of January, so in 2 weeks, I will be very happy to talk with Elodie Vio from ESA about the ESA's telecommunication outlook in 21. All these events are online on Eventbrite. And as always, we would like to hear your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily and our bi-weekly newsletters. And if you like to treat yourself with something special, just want to show it again, become a space watcher. We have these super cool t-shirts, and they also go well with the suit or with the jacket. Your support will help us to continue the cool stuff we do. Let's put it that way. Take your credit card and visit our fan shop at shop.spacewatch.global and pick something what is appropriate for you and what you like. So yeah, thank you very much for all of your interest today for the first event in this year. And thank you, Doug, for this exciting talk. And being my guest. And I know it will be something not easy to digest, but I'm really like the way you approach these topics. I mean, I may not agree with all of them, of course not, but I think they're profound, and it's a candid conversation that we have, and that's what I enjoy. And thank you very much for that. And again, thanks again to my entire team behind the scenes for doing their great job week by week again. I hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy, and thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you next week. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. Don't forget, become a space watcher. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Ciao. Bye-bye. Wherever you are.
Thank you, everybody. Great to talk to you all.